All right, welcome to Big Book Compendium. I'm Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic. So in 1937, what would become known as Alcoholics Anonymous was on fire. It was just a word of mouth program that consisted of 6 steps. They weren't particular steps, the same ones everywhere. It was a word of mouth steps. And some didn't even know they had 6. They would look at, oh yeah, we had 6. It was just the actions they did. And we'll get into that in a minute. But Bill, once they had 40 members, Bill started to realize they were on something big. And it came up with an idea. He wanted to bring this message to everywhere outside of Akron, New York. And his idea was to start a speaking tour around the country to break up these members that could speak in 7 different places. But when they laid out the books to do it, there was no money. So Bill had a backup plan, thank God. And his backup plan was called Book of Experience. And Book of Experience, of course, will become the big book. And the thing about Bill and these guys is they looked at what they were doing was groundbreaking. And this book will change the world. Once they started throwing ideas on what they want to do, they realized it would change the world, right? And they had that attitude. And Bill was the principal author. He had never written a book in his life. And Bill was a person that liked doing that stuff, jumping on stuff he didn't know. And he began writing the book on May 13th. May 1938. And basically, he had a little over 3 years sober. And the people who were helping him, like Fitz Mayo had 2 years, and Phil Smith had 2 years, and Hank Parkhurst, most of them had 2 years. One guy, Jim Burwell, probably the most influential person in the steps, and we'll get into him, he had like 2 or 3 months, but they all contributed big time. Let that sink in for a second. If it was written today, none of these people would be allowed to get near the book as far as creating it. You would have to have 30 years. They don't have enough time. That's what they would say. All these guys were on fire, and Bill was writing this book. He was on fire with God flowing through his veins. He's very guided. He was a visionary, and they knew he was a visionary, and they knew every part needed to connect to the real alcoholic. That's what this book was written for. The one alcoholic that cannot be fixed. The one who'd been lined up or locked up in asylums. So when they started to lay out the big book, Bill gathered members together to discuss the contents of the book. And right off the bat, discussions led to intense debates and arguments, especially when they discussed the spiritual contents of this book. And Bill wanted every voice to play a part. And he knew the book must appeal to every single type of person. So he was watching the people that are arguing, and as they were arguing about the book, he started to break them into committees. And the first committee he called the conservatives, and it consisted of a faction of evangelistic Christian members, very aggressive, outspoken religious members, led by Fitz Mayo. Fitz was a hardcore Oxford group member, and he was an Episcopal minister's son. And he wanted the book to strongly express Christian doctrine and biblical references and strongly emphasize the teachings of the Oxford group principles. And the second committee were called liberals, and they were less aggressive, laid back, religious members, but they didn't push that. And there was also those in there who were more spiritual than religious. It was just some more laid back, the voice of reason people. And they're on the same universal wavelengths as Bill. They were against using Christian doctrine in biblical terms, believing that non-dogmatic book would bring more alcoholics who otherwise would never consider our program. And they also had objection against using the word God, but believed it should be used sparingly and toned down. And they're the ones that suggested acronyms for God, not acronyms, but synonyms for God, not acronyms. Fearing, because they just feared too much God would scare people away. And the third committee was the ones that really molded these steps to make them different. They were the radicals, the atheist agnostics. And they People think, what? Atheists and Gnostics were the most, they were very outspoken. And the committee was led by Jim Burwell, I mentioned a minute ago. He only had a few months, but he was an atheist and these guys all did the steps. I mean, if I say they had 2 months, the steps were done. They let detox with their amends list in their hands. So they did it differently back then. They were shaking and, detoxing when they did their step work. And so Burwell was an atheist who opposed strong references to God, any strong references to God, and was known for being very aggressive and very argumentative, but was known as being one of the smartest people in the room. Another one of the radicals was Hank Parkhurst, a former agnostic who believed in universal power and wanted to downplay too much spiritual talk. These guys wanted a psychological book to lure the alcoholic in, like what they want to hear from a mental standpoint. He was Bill's right-hand man in writing the book. He was very outspoken. He was a great salesman, and he also had connections to get it published. And Bill said that there was not for Hank, there would be no book. It would never got done. And the committee wanted no references on God at all. Instead, spiritual nature or power is what they pushed for. They were totally against religious tone, believing that psychological book was the way to go. So what happened was every Tuesday, the committees would gather at Bill's home, and he would read what he had written the past week. The chapters, Bill's story, of course, we had Doc's opinion, but that was already done. And there's a solution, more about alcoholism. We agnostics got roughed out, ironed out, smashed, and put back together again. It took them 6 months to satisfy everybody with it. We agnostics was probably the one that brought the most heated arguments, because how many times God was mentioned and how it sounded too spiritual, so to speak. And that worried a lot of people. And every time it seemed, every time they got done, this had to be edited out, this had to be redone. It was never done, it seemed like, and Bill finally said it's done. And here's what Bill said. This is from an interview. I felt like an umpire rather than an author. It was a painful process with fierce resentments. The hassling over 4 chapters was really being horrific. I was exhausted on many days. I felt like throwing the book out the window. Arriving at chapter 5, I was dreading the reaction of the other members. Heavy burden weighed over me because it was time to lay out what would become the program. What the program was really about, how the program really worked. I knew I was writing about what would become the backbone of this movement. If written wrong, the movement would fall flat on its face. So basically, it was, it was time, to show others precisely how they recovered, how it works, right? And how the solution works. And writing this chapter was extremely important. It had to be alive, so that those in distant places could grasp it. And most important, follow the directions, right? Because there's no, if you're the first person in Sweden and gets a big book, well, you're probably doing the steps yourself and then going to a minister or somebody like that for your 5th step. And then the next person, then you get a sponsee. Think about those days. It's crazy. And that's the way they wrote the book in that fashion. So here's a word of mouth program with only around 50 members, and they did a variation of Oxford Group principles with powers over alcohol thrown on top. And Bill's goal here was to break down those 6 steps so that the fellow, and break them down into smaller pieces. So that's the whole thing of writing this chapter. And Bill had tons of pressure on him, but they trust him. They loved his vision. They loved his drive. And everyone knew Bill was the right man for the job. No one wanted his job, but they were on him all the time. And he wasn't sure he could do it. And he had those guys tell him he could at all times. And that's where Hank Parkhurst came in. But Bill's self-esteem towards the book, how he felt about himself, he even went to Oxford Group founder Sam Shoemaker and asked him to expand the 6 steps, to break them down. into smaller pieces, more steps. And he's like looking at Bill going, no. He turned him down. He says, you're the visionary here. This is your job. You're an alcoholic. This is your program. You need to do this. Here's where Bill said about writing the 2 pages of how it works with the steps. This is some deep stuff. I remember the evening in which the 12 steps were written. I was laying on my bed on Clinton Street with a pencil in hand and a pad of yellow scratch paper, feeling dejected and suffering from one of my imaginary ulcer attacks. I was in this anything but spiritual mood. I could not get my mind on the job, much less put my heart into it. But here was one of those things that had to be done. It needed to be done as clear and comprehensive as possible. If it was written poorly or too advanced, it would not work. I remember running over in my head the word of mouth phrases that were in current use, jolting them down. They added up to 6. So I'm going to put that up on the screen here real quick. One second. So these are the 6-step program that they did. This is Bill just jolting them down. And there some of them, except for the first one, that kind of mixed and matched. Some are worded differently, but this is, we admitted that we were licked. That means defeated, that we were powerless over alcohol. And the second one was made a moral inventory of our defects and or sins. We confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. It sounds like 5, right? Made amends to all those we have harmed. Sounds like 9. We tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward for money and prestige, and that's of course 12. We prayed to whatever for power to practice these principles. That sounds like 11. There's some definite steps missing in there. There's no step 2, that we know. There's no step 3. There's no 6 and 7. There's no 8. There's no 10. So these principles were not definite enough, and they needed to be deeper and broadened and expanded. I'm going to close this out for now. So here's Bill talking again. So he counted the 6 steps. Here he is again. I set out to draft more than 6. How many more I did not know. Perhaps those 6 chunks of truth should be broken into smaller pieces, enlarging its scope considerably. All I knew was we needed a definite statement and concrete principles that were clear and comprehensive as possible. There could not be a single loophole to which these rationalizing drunks could wiggle out of. Uninspired, I asked for guidance. Remember, he wasn't feeling good. He wasn't focused. So uninspired, I asked for guidance and relaxed. Then the words began tumbling out with astonishing speed. My pencil began to fly off the paper. My thoughts continued to flow as I wrote. Rarely have we seen a person fail who steadily followed our directions. I kept on writing until I felt I should stop, reviewing what I had written. He had written for 15 minutes, flowing for 15 minutes, numbering the new set of principles. I was rather surprised they added up to 12. A symbolic number, I thought. The 12 apostles, a significant figure in Christian and mystic lore. I was convinced that society should have 12 steps. So the one thing that stands out the most is he wrote how it works, where we hear Reddit meetings, in 15 minutes, flying through it without even thinking what he's going to write down. This book is one of the most important books ever written because it contains a message that saved millions, and every part needed to connect to the alcoholic. Every part. It needed to be perfect. Now, I know that Bill was a very talented writer. I'm not going to doubt that. And he was very smart. And he wrote this book with 3 years sober. Very guided, very spiritual, connected, and woke. What I'm saying is, I think from my personal perspective, this is my personal perspective, there was more than just a spiritually woke writer, a talented writer doing something here. I believe there's, this is a big religious word to say, but I believe there's some type of kind of like divine intervention going on. Like when he was writing the book, and divine intervention, all that means, it's not like that big a word. It just means that that some type of spiritual power, say within us, had a hand in has a hand in what's happening. How many times have you said something and it just comes out? You think about it. I mean, that's it. They say, the spirit's active, or God's active involvement in our affairs. I mean, think about what I just read. He asked for guidance and everything just flowed out perfect. I mean, if he would have messed it up, it would just been another book, right? Something to consider is he also he extended the program from 6 to 12, meaning he was adding he had not even stuff he hadn't practiced yet. He didn't practice, there 6 and 7 may have been practiced in some way, maybe after the 5th step, but not as a written step. There was definitely no 10, but it had to work. It needed to be perfect. And it's a miracle hall just turned out, and we know where miracles come from. And Bill felt the same, that something had come over him, perhaps another spiritual experience. That's what he connected it to. And he couldn't wait to bring what he had written to the committees. And I love this, because he goes to the committees and he's like, oh, these guys are going to love this. This is crazy. And he reads how it works, and they're not allowed to interrupt him. He asked, don't interrupt me. And he got done, and it sat for 3 minutes in dead silence. Like when you're at a meeting or any of these meetings, and someone has a topic and everyone sits there. It was like that for 3 minutes, right? And someone yelled out, why 12 steps? And it got louder, and like Bill said, sound like the stock exchange, and you got too much God in here, and who wants their defects removed? Why on our knees, and blah blah blah. And alcoholics, like one guy said, alcoholics won't buy into any of this. And Bill insisted on the importance of every word. And the debate on the steps went for months. On this page went for months. And here's how it played out. And and we're going to break that down. And if you go back to we're back on page 59. Here are the steps we took, which is suggested program of recovery, right? Now the original manuscript says, now we think you can take it. Here are the steps we took, suggested program recovery. Now you think you can take it, he says. So there was the original draft, the yellow sheet of paper he wrote on Clinton Street, right? The 2 pages he wrote in 15 minutes, and which he brought back to committee. The original draft would be modified and molded into what we call the original manuscript. So I think I've explained this before. So when you write a rough draft, from the rough draft, you come up with a type manuscript that they're molding it and talking to people and whatever, like they're talking here. And you want to be close to this finished project as much as possible, to submit to the publisher and to be accepted for publication. The publisher might even suggest, some positive ways to improve it. And the big book's original manuscript was very, very, very raw. And some of the words were very straightforward. And so my job today is, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to explain how each step evolved from the yellow sheet of paper, and then change, and then goes the manuscript into what we have here. So I'm going to put up another slide. Oh, I got to fix this real quick. All right. Give me 1 second. I'm going to make this exactly what I want it to be. Oops, too big. All right, here we go. Let me put up the slide. All right. So we're going to look at step 1. So the word of mouth step, and that is not the rough draft. This is the word of mouth step that they used in the 6 steps. Was we admitted we were licked, that we were powers over alcohol. And Bill's always, asked people if they were licked. That meant defeated. So for the original draft, he wrote, and that's the yellow sheet of paper, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that we were licked, right? And I believe he reversed it from the original one, we admitted that we were licked, we were powerless over alcohol. And he switched it around because Sokrat's emphasis on him about powerlessness and that allergy obsession being there, right? Being very strong with it. And everyone can see the thing, right? Up there. I think so. Okay, good. My computer was telling me something weird. But I believe he reversed it because of Soakworth. One of the people on the committee suggested we admitted that we're powerless to manage our lives, which was no one liked because there's no mention of alcohol. And we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives had become unmanageable, was kind of tossed around. When the manuscript came out, Ruth Hawks was the typist. She was amazing. And she suggested to get rid of the end and put an M dash in there. And an M dash is a punctuation mark to indicate a strong change, to emphasize the end of the sentence, to put strong words at the end of the sentence to make it stand out more, to put meaning behind it. Original manuscript says, admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. And they changed it one more time in the big book. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and our lives had become unmanageable. So they just put the we on there. Step two came to believe that God could restore our sanity, is what he wrote down. You gotta remember, he was flying when he was writing these down too. Jim Burwell, the atheist, suggested power greater than ourselves because it's easier to take in and digest. And he thought it widened the gateway. And everyone agreed. So that, he liked the idea, exactly what he said to the committee, this will widen the gateway so all those who suffer can pass through, regardless of their belief or lack of belief or not wanting to believe at all. And he would use himself as an example. The original manuscript and the big book are the same. Came to believe that our power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. They'll see one that some here of these don't change, and it truly stands out over the magic of these steps. And remember, there was no step 2 before. There was no step 2. Step 3. So making a decision to turn our life over to the care of God was not one of the 6 steps, but it was a practice. And they did it before the steps. It was a way of them turning themselves over to the program. Like you see in Bill's story, it seems like the 3rd step, something probably like that. I don't know exactly too much about what they said and did, but basically they would say something before, they started or for, and are you ready to turn your one life over to God? Drop knees and do this prayer. Dr. Bob he was harsh. He would kick guys out of the hospital if they didn't drop their knees. They'd be up there like drool on themselves and detoxing. And he would say, are you ready to turn your life over to God? Drop your knees and do a prayer. And they would say no, and he would kick him out of the bed, and someone else wants this bed. My point is that a part of their practice was not looked at as a principle. And Bill was very adamant about wanting this to be here. Original draft was made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care and direction of God. The care and direction of God. Jim Burwell suggested the phrase God as you understand him. So you see how this Burwell guy is really playing into a part that makes us comfortable, which it didn't have a negative reaction at all. And Burwell would wait until everyone else yelled and screamed so he would bring in his idea. And they said his ideas just came off the top of his head. That's the type of person he was. He was much that type of person. And it's choosing your own conception of God. That's all that God's understanding. The original manuscript said, made a decision to turn our will and lives over to the care and direction of God as we understood it. So, everyone in the committee agreed with the God as we understood him. They argued about the care and direction part. And the fear is why is a person that, that's brand new to, God concept could digest the word, care, they could digest the word care, but not the direction. It was just too much. Think about that. You got a person that doesn't even understand the concept of God. They're saying you're going to make a decision to go into the direction of God. It's kind of scary. So they thought it was too fire and brimstone, and they it might reawaken resentments from the past, is what they saw from religious experiences. From the book we got, made decisions to turn our will and lives over to the care of God as we understood. So step 4, oops, in the bottom there, I kind of messed up my screen here. Step 4 was we made a moral inventory of our defects. That's the word of mouth version. When it was written in the rough draft, it was exactly the way it was written. It's been unchanged, absolutely unchanged. And that is made a search team for us more inventory of ourselves. Here's the thing. Bill fought tooth and nail to keep this as it was, because he was a huge proponent of inventory. And the radicals loved it because they wanted the psychological stuff. But Bill said, this is not going to change. We're not going to change this step. You guys can tell me all you want. I'm not changing this. And they're like, okay. And I'm glad that's the way it went. I'll be honest with you. So step 5. So the word of mouth version was we confess or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. It was written that some people just call it confession, other, Akron area, they just use the word confession. But the original draft confess to God, to ourselves, and another person the exact nature of our defects. The committee understood where it was going here. We had to have that step. We had it before. They argued and argued and argued over the word confession. The evangelist Christians said, you got to have it in there. And the liberal ones were like off. They argued within themselves. And the other ones were like, I don't like that in there at all. And the atheist agnostics argued that it was an Oxford group word used all the time, confession, and we're trying to separate, and that got everyone going. So the conservatives really wanted it to be in there, but they're the hardcore religious members, but they were outnumbered, and they changed it to a simple word, admitted, which is, think about that. I mean, you're taking out a word confession everybody knows and putting admitted in there. Bill called for a change, defect to exact nature wrong, because he used defect in 6, realizing he wanted words that meant synonymous. I mean, defects of character, shortcomings, exactly, are all the same thing, and they're just synonymous words. So it appeared in original manuscript the same way as it does in the big book. Admitted to God, to ourselves, another person, the exact nature of our wrongs. I mean, you look at that compared to the one Bill wrote down, not much difference except confessed to God. How would you digest that versus admitted to God? Stuff we never heard before, no matter how religious we grew up or didn't. Step 6, original draft. Yellow sheet of paper. We're entirely ready. We're entirely willing that God remove our defects. Committee changed, in original manuscript to we're entirely ready to remove all these defects of character. And they changed it again for the big book, and we got entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, because while willing and Ready mean the same thing. Willing they said sounded much like a beginning, and ready sounds more right now. They wanted that word in there, and that made sense. It was said it was changed from that God, like the original one in here, it said, we're entirely ready, that God, because they wanted the person to let God do it. That's why it says entirely ready to have God. In the big book, it says, let God remove everything. Let it in. Pretty interesting. Step 7. The draft, humbly on her knees, asks him to remove our defects, holding nothing back. There was a huge argument about on our knees. I'll get that in a minute, but the manuscript didn't change much. The words were different. Humbly on our knees, asks him to remove our shortcomings, holding nothing back. Again, the argument persisted, and the Christians, Bill thought, since the Christians didn't have their word on God and confession as much, let's keep this one for them. But the arguments persisted, and the argument was about on their knees. And so they eventually it was the Christians that had said, just take it out. It ain't that important. And then holding nothing back. And for the big book, Bill supposedly disappeared in the back room, supposedly. I don't know how true that is, but came back out and he went to the restroom or what, but he came back out and had written, how about this, guys? Humbly, humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. And one guy yelled out, the shorter the better. And they all agreed. Beautiful. Oops, I just messed that up. The bottom one here. Step 8. Original manuscript and the draft were the exact same. Made a list of all persons we had harmed, became willing to make complete amends to them all. Complete amends. So for whatever reason, the committee removed complete amends. And we got, I wish they would have kept it, because it's about complete amends. It's about complete amends. But they thought it was too straightforward, and we made a list of all the persons we had harmed, became willing to make amends to them all. So step 9, the word of mouth was we made amends to all those we had harmed. Very straightforward. And the one thing I want to point out about 8 and 9, there was a ton of confusion in the room when they got to 9, because they know amends had to be in there. And they thought that 8 was the amends. And then all of a sudden he has amends again in 9. And they're like, why is he saying it again? And they thought 8 was telling us to go make amends, became willing to make amends to them all. The fact that they like the wording in 9 more than 8, they're like, well, which one are we going to keep? Why did we need 8? And Bill got vocal. He said something famous. He says, because alcoholics like loopholes. We don't want any loopholes. It was the first time he used that phrase to the committee, and they got it like that. Instantly, they got it. That one was getting ready to do it, and one was doing it. Very much a mirror of step 6 and 7, being preparing, action, right? No loopholes. And the original draft was made amends to such people wherever possible. The committee added, except when to do so would injure them or others, which is very important. And a big part of that, we'll get to step 9, is telling the person what you did. A lot of people like to tell the person what they did, and it causes problems. We'll get more to that when we get to 9. Original manuscript and big book are the same. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so will injure them or others. This brings up to another original step, 10. Original drafts, the original manuscript and the big book are all the exact same. Continue to take personal inventory and were wrong, properly admit it. It never changed. And people argued with him, but he would not budge. Isn't it interesting that 2 steps he wouldn't budge on our inventory steps? That must say that Bill saw something important here. See, he was a huge advocate at 10, because Bill was a man of compassion. And what broke his heart when people would get this, because you gotta remember, the people that walked in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, the meetings then, they did the steps. Everyone went to detox, or they got called to their house, and you didn't leave your house until the steps were done. You walked into the rooms the first time, to the meetings the first time, you had done the steps. What broke his heart was these people would have an awakening and thought their awakening would be everlasting. It's like someone winning $1 million and thinking that $1 million would last for the rest of their life. And these people would think it'd be everlasting and they drink again. We see that happen too, even with step 10. He wanted me in writing, this is a way of life. 4 through 9 is a way of life. What I just went over, it's a way of life. It's amazing how they asked Bill one time, how'd you come up with 10? He said, it just flowed out the pen. He knew, amazing. Gives me chills. 11, word of mouth version. We prayed to God for power to practice these precepts. That's the word of mouth version, right? So nearly all these early members were Oxford Group members for a few, and they did something called early morning quiet time. So meditation and prayer was big. It wasn't, it was a given. It's like step 9 was a given. Confession was a given. The original drafts sought through prayer and meditation to improve our contact with God. The committee changed this for the original manuscript, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our contact with God, praying for only knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. That was brought by the liberals, the more spiritual in the middle people. And I don't remember which one it was, but they said to improve our contact with God. Now this would evolve even further after the manuscript was written, and they changed it by adding probably the most important word when it comes to God in this entire book, conscious contact with God. And that word conscious was brought, that was brought from the radicals. They said you got to have conscious contact. And Bill, because they're all in the metaphysics, everyone in the room, Emmett Fox, Ernest Holmes, Joel Goldsmith, all those great writers at the time who spoke of conscious contact with God. They're like, yes. So the radicals, atheists and Gnostics, they love those writers, and they're able to look beyond, Christians and some of those guys. They knew how to talk to these other people through metaphysics, through these adult writers, and then they also added God as you understood him at the end. So the big book we got sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. The longest stuff we have. Pretty deep. Step 12, the word of mouth version. We tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward and money or prestige. So we all know the story behind, Bill lay in the hospital and he prayed for guidance, and he all of a sudden thought of a society of alcoholics. And he knew it would be the backbone. The original draft and manuscript are the same. Having had a spiritual experience resolve this course of action, we try to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and practice these principles in all our affairs. Bill was adamant about carrying the message to others, especially alcoholics, because he saw AA as bigger than just AA. This book could go to anybody, anyone. But the committee disagreed, and the argument was they changed it for the first edition. The very first printing said, having had a spiritual experience as a result of this course of action, we try to carry the message to alcoholics and practice principles in our affairs. The second printing of the big book, because they realized not everyone was having a spiritual experience, they changed it to having had a spiritual awakening as a result of this course of action. We try to carry the message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. Actually, if you have a first printing big book with those words in there, it's probably worth about $250,000. Just saying. But for the big book, we got having had a spiritual awakening. That's the thing there. And Bill expanded these 6 steps to 12 to eliminate wiggle room. That's why he did it. Like he said, alcoholics like loopholes. The anti-wiggle room steps are 2 is anti-loophole wiggle room. There's no way to wiggle out of that one. 6 and 7, 8 and 10. 3, you could say, is there too, but they're already using that, right? Matter of fact, Bill said years later, if it wasn't for the fact that we're doing making a decision to take action, so to speak, was a very forefather to 6 and 7. It was all expanded from that, broken down different directions. Here's Bill again speaking. He says, we are only operating a spiritual kindergarten in which people are enabled to get over drinking, and by the grace to go on living to better effect. Each man's theology has to be his own quest, his own affair. We'll go back to the book. If anyone wants this list, I'm going to post it later on. I'll put it in the thing too. So back to the book here. It says, many have exclaimed, what an order, I can't go do with it. Do not be discouraged. No one among us, I mean, first 100, could mean anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is, we're willing to grow on spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Notice it does not say progress rather than perfection. If people want to say at meetings, so the fellowship slogan, they say it to someone when some guy made his amends and someone's going, hey man, it's not perfection, you're going too fast or something. They say it's not progress and perfection. They're leaving out the word spiritual. It's spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. It means we must always be focused on growth first. The question is, can we have spiritual perfection? And it's something that I've thought about for years, but if you go to page 14 in the big book, he tells us something very interesting. He kind of tells us, page 14, for if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. So we can have spiritual perfection, because here's the thing: we all talk about what are the steps to make us whole. Perfection means complete or whole. So we're seeking wholeness. We're trying to be whole. The same thing we did try to be whole when we were drinking or using drugs. In this case, spiritual perfection means spiritual complete or wholeness, the circle of the triangle, wholeness. So can we be spiritually whole? Absolutely. I'm not saying we're going to be spiritual perfection every day and every second. It's not sainthood. What I'm saying is, through extremely powerful, this vehicle called the steps, we can be rocking another dimension. We will experience different points where we will experience wholeness, spiritual perfection. Like when you make an amends and you float away, or when you do inventory with someone in the 5th step, and when that person right in front of you changes right in front of you, or when the obsession is removed and insanity is restored. Sanity is restored, not insanity. A word I look at is, don't put spiritual perfection. The way I look at it is like this: don't put spiritual perfection ahead of spiritual progress. Why? Because you can't experience spiritual perfection without spiritual growth. It's a part of it. We're always on the growth train. We're always on that train, and we're going to experience numerous things on that train. And one of them is spiritual perfection. And spiritual perfection is just a result of spiritual growth. Therefore, spiritual progress can lead to elements of experiencing spiritual perfection. Back to the book on page 59 or 60. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. So pertinent means relevant, logical, right? In other words, the doctor's opinion in the first 60 pages is condensed into 3 pertinent ideas, right? So the big book has all the information a person needs to understand the grave nature of alcoholism, is what he's saying, right? About power. We've had 48 pages to see that. you know, or I mean 58 pages total, a lot of it. Now it's followed by ABCs. And the reason Bill wants you to be convinced that you are powerless over alcohol, being convinced you need power before you can come into step 3. Be convinced you need power. And this isn't the first time where he's fallen back on his steps. So we take, on page 30, we take step 1, you know, to concede you're almost self, you're alcoholic. To surrender you're almost self, you're alcoholic, right? Then you go into we agnostic, it's kind of questions for you. If when you drink, if you cannot quit entirely, or when drinking you have low control, you might take it, probably alcoholic. He's reminding us again, and that good sponsor will ask you that as a question. 47 says, are you willing to believe in power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity? You know, the cornerstone. He asks us there. And it won't be the last time he asks us questions, you know, and when we end step 5, he asks us all those, you know, look at the first 5 proposals again. He asks us if you admit anything, you know, he's asking about the cornerstone and the keystone again. You know, it's all about being convinced. And so he brings these ABCs are not simple questions like people want to believe, nor are they beliefs. The difference between believing and convinced means completely certain that something is true or real. Believing is simply acknowledging that something might be real or is real, true or real. So you want to be convinced that something's real or just acknowledge it? Just, yes, I can see that. That's believing. So it is not, do you believe you're alcoholic, can manage your own life? Are you convinced you're alcoholic, cannot manage your own life? Right? That's the point he's trying to get from this, and from when he written it, you know, the original manuscript, all the way to here, to the final book, big book. And I'll show you, I'll point it out to you. But to take one step further, being convinced also means certain, completely certain. Completely certain means beyond doubt. So the key element of the ABC is to be completely certain. No doubt, no doubt. These facts are about, you know, have to be about your life. We must be convinced we're certain before we can move on to step 3. So our description of the alcoholic, the chap, the agnostic, and our personal ventures make 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we're alcoholic, cannot manage our lives. So from all the information we've discussed, we found out the truth why we're alcoholic. We have an allergy and a mental obsession. And thanks to the concept, to that concept, it's easy to get full knowledge of your condition and be convinced you're powerless. If one is not convinced, they need to go look at step 1 again. As far as being unmanageable, that's just, you know, the inability to manage our life, you know, to accomplish things without difficulty, you know, the inability to do that. You know, there's no skipping over this at all. There's no maybe on this one. You're either convinced or you're not. There's no free pass. No free pass. The second a person is convinced, they go on to B. That probably no human power could relieve our alcoholism. That sounds like step 2 now, right? No human power means human power has failed us, you know, meaning you need a power greater than yourself. It's not it's not convinced. If you're not convinced of B, it means you're not convinced of A, 100%. And that happens. I've sponsored guys where they're 100% convinced their power is a rock, but not convinced of this. We have to go back and look at step 1 again. There's no free pass here. There's no, you know what, let's do this anyways. You know, they have to be convinced that no human power, not saying convinced that God, convinced that no human power can relieve your alcoholism. The way I put it is, are you convinced that you cannot relieve your alcoholism? Are you convinced that your family, your friends, everyone around you? You know, so if you're convinced of B, then you can move on to C, that God could and would if you were sought. Still step 2. Sought is past tense, of course, for seek. which means to look for, to locate, discover, to establish the existence. It's an action word. And C is telling us that God can remove our alcoholism if we seek him through action, not wait around for him to tap us on the shoulder. If God could and would, wouldn't it make sense to seek him? To seek God? I mean, sadly, most people only know C from parrot talk at meetings, and they all say it at the end, and they've never done it. It's also the beginning of building a bridge to 3. This, by the time when you're doing C and thinking about it and being convinced, you're slowly building that bridge to to 3. And C is not easy, it's very misunderstood. Lots of people think C is asking a person, do you believe that God would if he were sought? Again, it's not a question. It's not, do you believe that God could and would? Is it a fact that God could and would if he were sought? This is where it gets very tough and confusing, because it's not hard to be convinced of A. We have the evidence. In B, we have the evidence. For some, C is very tough, because how can you be convinced that God couldn't be your sought if you've never experienced God? Think about that for a second. That's what he's asking us, is be convinced that God couldn't would if you were sought. It's not a fake it till you make it thing, like some people will say. How can you be convinced of something can save you if we do not truly know what it's capable of doing, because we never experienced anything you know in life? Is from a direct experience. Anything else is a theory. A lot of theories going on here. So how can you be convinced through a theory that God could have would if you were sought? How can you be convinced of that? Here's how: by seeing what God has done for others in front of you. It's that spiritual person sitting in front of you, breaking down the book, your sponsor, or that one person that shares a meaning that blows your mind, other recovery friends, that do the work. And obviously from the contents of this book, just like the 2 others, there's no free pass here. Here's the exact ABCs from the original manuscript and what follows that shows us we have to be convinced. A, so this is before they wrote the book past tense, right? That you were alcoholic and cannot manage your own life. B, that probably no human power can relieve your alcoholism. That C, that God can and will. It changed that quite a bit. And then there's this line that is the most controversial line from the original manuscript and my favorite. If you're not convinced of these 3 vital issues, you got to reread the book to this point, or else throw it away. There's that word, convinced. So by seeing that, it tells me the ABCs are about being convinced and not believing, right? You're only going to seek God by being, here's the thing is, you're only going to seek God by being convinced, certain, positive, beyond doubt that you need it. Because if you don't have a leg to stand on, you still think you can manage your life. Maybe, being convinced, there's that word again, we're at step 3. So he's telling us again, that's what we need, to be convinced. If not, reread the book or throw it away. And he's straightforward there. Which, being convinced of step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and life over to God as we understood him. Just what do we mean by that? Just what do we do? So we're going to stop right there. Next week, we begin our journey into step 3. And this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where everything changes in this book study. Because we're going to break down step 3 word for word. Then we're going to get into instincts. And that's the most vital information anyone could possibly offer you. So I'm going to stop recording now.